some Palestinians say, well, if we use peaceful means, people ignore us. And if we use violent means, people tell us it's not going to work and we shouldn't do it. So they're in a kind of situation where what is it that's going to work? And I think that's not an unreasonable question. If you're being told you can't use violence, then what is it you're being told you should use?
Yes, this and other statements like it have not made him many friends in certain circles. So today we explore the intricate world of terrorism through the lens of one of its leading experts, Professor Richard English. Currently at Queen's University in Belfast, Richard has spent decades dissecting the nature and impact of political violence. In his provocative book, Does Terrorism Work?, Richard challenges the conventional belief and explores specific cases where terrorism appears to have influenced political events like the Jewish terrorism of the 1930s and 40s. He compares cases from the Irish Republican Army, Jewish groups like the Irgun, Lehi and Hagana, and jihadist movements, and argues that terrorism sometimes does achieve its strategic objective. This somewhat controversial stance forces us to rethink our assumptions about the effectiveness of such violent tactics. But Richard's insights are not just academic. He dives into the root causes of terrorism, suggesting that political grievances, social injustices, and historical contexts play a critical role in fueling such violence. This examination forces us to grapple with the uncomfortable reality that terrorism is not just senseless violence, but a calculated strategy driven by deeper issues, showing that terrorists are not crazy psychopaths. Instead, they're often rational actors motivated by political, social, and ideological grievances. They employ terror as a means to draw attention to their causes, disrupt the status quo, and to force political change. In fact, the most frightening aspects of terrorists is their normalcy. And Richard is not the only one who makes this argument. The Israeli scientist and researcher Sajid Yehoshua told me exactly the same.
I know it's very easy for us to think of these people as psychopaths or, very violent and crazy people, but they're not.
She's a criminal profiler and has interviewed most of the captured leaders of groups that Israel views as terrorist organizations. So get ready to engage with the formidable intellect of Professor Richard English and re-examine the unsettling truth about terrorism's place in our world. But before we do, a quick call to action. Some of the best interviews on this channel are shadow banned, which means YouTube is not presenting them to you, the viewer. The latest example is my interview with James Bamford, where we discussed the truly amazing story that underlies Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption scandal. Did you know that a Hollywood billionaire not only stole nuclear secrets from America, but then sold them to Israel, and that Netanyahu helped him to stay out of troubles to this very day? And then Netanyahu turned around and started to ask for favors, hence the bribery charges in Israel against him. Other examples are the interviews with the so-called Hamas lawyer Stanley Cohen, or the interview with the former chief of staff of Colin Powell, who told me that the white powder in the test tube that Colin Powell showed the world when he testified at the UN just before the war on Iraq was actually salt. So if you're interested in content that apparently you're not supposed to see, content that goes against the mainstream narrative, have a look at some of the previous interviews that we have recorded for your pleasure. And of course, it really helps to spread the news if you like and subscribe to this channel. Professor Richard English, thank you so much for joining. How's it going?
Very well, thank you, Thomas. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise, and I was really looking forward to it, and I have prepared myself well. I think the entry point for me was your book, Does Terrorism Work? That's quite a provocative title. So tell us.
It's a difficult question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, if you try to suggest that it does work, then people who've been victims of terrorist violence feel understandably that this is a painful thing to hear. On the other hand, if you denounce what people who are called terrorists are doing and what they think they're struggling for, or the things through history that have been achieved through such violence, then it seems to me you're missing part of the point. So what I've always tried to do, Thomas, is to write as calmly as I can about things which are often treated in very non-calm ways. I fully respect why people find political violence and terrorism a difficult subject, and I understand the title of this book, Does Terrorism Work, is very sharp-edged, but I felt what we really needed to do was have a proper conversation about why people carry out this violence, what it does and does not achieve, and ultimately on all sides, I think, to try and minimize human suffering by looking at the root causes for what happens so that we can try and prevent awfulness in the future from whichever side it comes.
I think you put your finger exactly where it hurts. Yeah, the root cause. We're gonna come to that. Yeah. Now I had a look. So since 9/11 in 2001, more than 45,000 research papers with the word terrorism have been written in the title. And if you extend the research on Google Scholar with in-text searches, then you get more than a million papers. Now, despite these large numbers, some researchers have pointed out that the counterterrorism is actually failing. So there's Mark Segman, and I don't want to make this too academic, yeah, but there's Mark Segman who criticized that those who control the funding often pursue political agendas. I mean, that's obvious, yeah. Then an interesting one I found is Andrew Silke, who found that only 34% of the terrorism research actually provides new data. The rest just regurgitates, yeah. And then I found an article from you from 2016. It's called The Future of Terrorism Study in European Journal for International Security. And you argue that the risk of disciplinary silos in both academic and governmental research is actually breaking down. Also, it's important to breaking down these silos if we want to be successful in counterterrorism. So there are lots of interests in the backgrounds, not the least of which is money. Can we discuss this for a moment?
Yeah, you've raised a lot of really important points there, Thomas, I think. I mean, after the 9/11 attacks, there was a huge increase in the amounts of research on non-state terrorism, particularly, I think, American-based research in ways that were transformative in terms of the scale of the amount of work done. I personally think a lot of that work focused too much on the symptom and not on the cause. In other words, terrorism involves bloodstained and awful violence, but in some ways it's a symptom of the things we need to be studying, whether those are rivalries between rival nationalisms or rivalries within and between groups that believe in particular religious ways of organizing the world or whatever it is. And it seemed to me there was a sending of a lot of the energy to the wrong address. The other thing is there's a complicated issue because a lot of that research emerged because there was hugely expanded funding, particularly in the US, but not just in the US. And quite often what the funders were looking for was a way of saying, how can we catch the bad guys? How can we defend the United States against its enemies and so on, which from a state perspective is entirely understandable. But it sometimes meant that there was an emphasis on things which probably were not the most helpful. So, for example, for a long time, the focus was overwhelmingly on jihadist violence against the West, while much of the terrorist violence around the world had other causes and other dynamics. And I think also the point that you refer to about silos means that quite often different academic disciplines talk to themselves rather than talking across between politics and history and international relations and sociology and area studies and theology and so forth. And the other thing is, I think that there was a geographical problem that most of the research on terrorism was done in rich Western countries where there's comparatively little terrorism in practice, whereas many of the countries within which much of the violence was happening, historically India, Peru, Pakistan, in more recent times Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, for reasons which we can discuss and which are understandable, there isn't the infrastructure of research. And so a lot of those people with intimacy of understanding and experience were not part of the debate. So there was a strange kind of power imbalance in the research, as well as I think a focus on some of the issues being misguided. That said, there has been a lot more work done. Despite what Mark Sageman says, I think a lot of research has moved the debate forward, and I think that's welcome. I would rather we focused always on looking at the long term and looking on why the violence happens, rather than being mesmerized by the awfulness of the understandably painful and agonizing events as they developed. And I think in recent times, in regard to Israel and Palestine, again, there's an understandable horror at much of what has happened. What I, as a scholar, want to do is to say, how can we make the next 50 years in that part of the world less awful than the violence has meant it has been for people on all sides in recent times. That means more than just condemning violence on one side or other. It seems to me it's got to get to the deeper causes behind the violence which causes damage and causes death.
I'm going to ask you now a provocative question because you mentioned Israel and Palestine. I think in regards to terrorism, you have kind of a microcosm if you observe the situation between Israel and Palestine. So when October the 7th happened, almost every single interviewer, reporter, whatever, with a microphone under whoever they were interviewing, the first question was, do you condemn Hamas? What are you saying to that approach? And I'm aiming at the cause, of course. Yeah.
So I mean, first of all, let me be absolutely clear. I think the attacks of October 7th were atrocious. I think they were unjustified. I think the violence that they involved was appalling and the suffering should have been condemned. I think the difficulty is that clearly the root causes of violence in Israel-Palestine are to do really with two rival nationalisms between peoples who are looking for autonomy and for dignity and for human flourishing. And the power imbalance there, since the establishment of the State of Israel, has been very heavily on one side rather than the other. In that sense, it's no justification of Hamas violence to say that Palestinian flourishing has been denied, but it is an important part of explaining what's happened and what needs to happen next. So my argument with this would be to say that I have no problem with people condemning the violence of October the 7th. What I do think we need to do is to say that protecting people in that region, including protecting Israelis, has to be about addressing the issues which relate to Palestinian humans flourishing, which relate to Palestinian statehood. In my view, ultimately, I still think a two-state solution is the best of the flawed outcomes that might emerge. And therefore, I want to go beyond condemnation. So I'm not, Thomas, I wouldn't be against condemning awful violence, but I want to go beyond the politics of condemnation, because that seems often just to say that all you need to do is to say this terrible thing has happened and they're the villains, rather than saying, what are we going to do in the next 50 years? So my sense is, ironically, I think the best counterterrorism is going to involve dealing with politics. The best counterterrorism is going to involve saying, how can we, in the Israel-Palestine case, how can we try and build arrangements which mean that people do not feel that this awful violence is legitimate?
In your view, what's the relationship between terrorism and the socioeconomic situation of the people that are affected?
I think in the case of many people, terrorism emerges from a sense of desperate humiliation. I think in the Palestinian case, that's clearly true. I think much of what Hamas has gained support for is the sense of shifting from humiliated deference to proud resistance and defiance. I think if you look at the way in which they engage in their politics and the symbolism of it, and some of the violence as well, it's about a sense of defiance in the face of humiliation. I think socioeconomic aspects to that play a significant part. Not to say that terrorists tend to be the worst off people in the world. You know, many of the people who suffer appallingly in the world in terms of injustice do not engage in terroristic violence. But I do think a lot of terroristic violence emerges from people feeling humiliated, people feeling desperate, and people feeling that there is no other way than the violence to try and pursue human flourishing and human opportunity. For people like myself who are against people using violence, and I think both the Israeli state and Hamas have exaggerated the justifications and the benefits of violence. I think they both exaggerated what they can achieve through it. What I need to do is to try and persuade politicians and citizens to say is, can we find other ways that people in Gaza, that Palestinians in the West Bank can feel that they can pursue goals in ways that will be successful? I think the great flaw in recent years in terms of Israeli politics has been to, under the Netanyahu government certainly, has been to remove the possibility of thinking that there is some kind of progress towards a political goal. As I say, I don't believe, Thomas, that justifies 7th of October at all. I think it was unjustifiable, but I do think you need to look at ways of producing progress which involve non-violent methods of redress. That means that the international community as well has to respond to this in a different way. That means the international community has to say that we cannot just keep saying Palestinian violence is wrong. We have to keep saying, what is it that is going to mean that you get a different kind of conjunction of politics in the Middle East, which means that people's lives are more able to flourish than has been the case. Not just in Gaza, I think also in the West Bank. I think the suffering there has been extraordinarily difficult. And I think also the politics of increased Jewish settlement have made things more difficult for the Palestinians, but have in a way also made things more difficult in terms of Israeli security, because they've increased the sense of humiliation and desperation for many Palestinians.
Coming back to the title of your book, yeah, Does Terrorism Work? There is a certain irony of fate involved here if we consider how Israel was created. Because both the Americans and the British have called, let's say, the precursor of the IDF, the Lehi, Irgun, Hagana, etc., have called them terrorist organization. So one could argue that the fact that, well, I call Israel a bit provocative, is virtually a child of terror. And now they're getting basically the same medicine that they have produced, then back from Hamas in that instance. So how can you match this?
In my book, I argue that strategic terrorist success, in other words, getting your headline central primary goal, is quite rare historically. Ironically, one of the examples which you might cite as a clear example of there being substantial strategic success was the Jewish terrorism of the 1930s and 1940s, which accelerated and contributed to the establishment of the State of Israel. If we'd been having this conversation in the late 1930s or in the 1940s, people in the United Kingdom would have been undoubtedly clear that Jewish terrorism was a problem. Jewish terrorism was attacking British targets, not just in Palestine, but also in Britain. And the terrorist villains were the Jews. Okay, so in that sense, I think there is no doubt that the Jewish state emerged partly in response to terroristic campaigns in favor of it. Now, whether people think that's a good thing or a bad thing will depend on their politics, but it's one of those examples where you did have strategic success, I think, for terrorist violence. My view is that if we are going to talk about the outcomes of terrorism, we need to move beyond just using the word as a term of abuse and say, well, what does it produce? In that case, I think you could also look maybe at the FLN in Algeria. I think more recently, you could possibly look at some of the violence the Taliban used, who then returned to power in 2021 after the American occupation. You could see some examples where terrorism does seem to produce headline goals. I argue in my book, Does Terrorism Work?, that mostly terrorism doesn't produce its headline goals of strategic success, though I think it gets lesser things, partial secondary goals and so forth. But I think the Israeli case is one where terrorism was undoubtedly used to try and produce the state, and terrorism played a part in accelerating the British departure from that part of the world. It wasn't the only reason. There was British imperial overstretch. It was becoming economically difficult to sustain the empire. There was an understandable feeling after the atrocity of the Holocaust that something had to be done in terms of a Jewish homeland. I respect all of that, but there is no doubt that terrorism was used by Jewish terrorists. And it seems to me, and I argue in the book, there's little doubt that that did, at the very least, accelerate the establishment of the State of Israel in the 1940s.
Yeah, that's an argument that I hear very often. After the Holocaust, Jews needed a state somewhere, but the Balfour Declaration was signed in 1917, right? That was way before the time. Yeah.
But it was, and I think the British commitment to a Jewish state long predated the Holocaust. I think the sense that there was something morally pressing about a Jewish state being delivered was reinforced by the Holocaust, and I think that was historically explicable. I think the difficulty, of course, was that the land on which the Jewish Israeli state was being established was not land on which nobody lived. And I think that's obviously the issue, that you have these two catastrophes in the 1940s, the atrocity of the Holocaust, and you have the catastrophe for the Palestinian people in a different way of what happens in terms of their dispossession. You're not going to get a neat resolution of this, it seems to me, in the future. I don't think either Hamas or Israel, as imagined by Netanyahu, is going to achieve complete success. My argument, therefore, is what we need to do is to pursue the most productive kind of compromise. It's not impossible. At the moment, it seems bleakly unrealizable because of the scale of the awful violence. On the other hand, I think that had we been having this conversation in the early 1990s, people would have said that the Israel-Palestine peace process would work. And actually, people would have said the Northern Ireland peace process had no chance in the early 1990s. Now everybody takes for granted that Northern Ireland broadly moved towards peace. And I think right off the chances in Israel, there is the possibility, it seems to me, it will have to come as in a post-Netanyahu government period. There is the possibility of there being a re-energizing of attempts to produce some kind of deal, but it does have to produce a deal which allows for Palestinian human flourishing and ultimately, in my view, for some form of Palestinian statehood being pursued.
It's, you said flourishing. That's a really nice word. Yeah, but the situation, I mean, not just after October 7, yeah, but the last 75 years for the Palestinians is quite dramatic, to say the least. Yeah.
And part of the problem for them is that people say, and people like me will say, I don't think Palestinian terrorism is justified. I don't think it should happen. Some Palestinians say, well, if we use peaceful means, people ignore us. And if we use violent means, people tell us it's not going to work and we shouldn't do it. So they're in a kind of situation where what is it that's going to work? And I think that's not an unreasonable question. If you're being told you can't use violence, then what is it you're being told you should use? I think there the international community has a big responsibility. I think the United States of America more than anybody else, because they've been the most significant ally of the state of Israel. But not only the United States of America, I think other international actors have to decide either that they're going to just throw their hands up and say, we're not going to do anything about this, or they have to throw themselves behind an effort to try and produce what I'm referring to as human flourishing. I would also stress, Thomas, that this would be the best way also of protecting Israeli citizens' security. It's perfectly reasonable for Israelis not to want to be attacked and murdered. But the best way of that happening, in my view, is not what's happened since October the 7th in terms of the Israeli response. That seems to me likely to have produced a loss of sympathy for Israel and a desire for revenge on the part of Palestinians. I think what you need to do is produce something which is political rather than over-relying, in my view, on military methods.
At the moment, it looks more like Israel really tries to drive at least the Palestinians out of the Gaza Strip. That's what it looks like at the moment, yeah.
And I think the process of trying to reassert control, possibly the people talking about the idea of more Jewish settlers going into Gaza, for example. Personally, I think that would be a disastrous move in all sorts of ways, actually, Thomas. My sense there is that those states which have given strong support to Israel, the United Kingdom has been one, the United States more spectacularly and more significantly in terms of resources, also have a responsibility to say friendship comes with a sense of responsibility on your part about what we're going to do. And there, I think that a post-Netanyahu government, a government in the United Kingdom likely to be led by soon-to-be Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Goodness knows who's going to be the president of the United States, but whoever's the president, the regime of the United States is not entirely dependent on them. So we do need those to be long-term engagements. Or what are we going to do? Are we going to say that, the Gaza war of 2008, 2012, 2014, 2023, that this is just what's going to happen? I think that would be a catastrophe, and I think that would be a moral abdication of responsibility for the international community, for a region which has already suffered. The other thing about the conflict is I think every life that's lost is equally precious. But at the Gaza wars that I've referred to, the number of casualties on the Palestinian side on every occasion dwarfs those who are on the Israeli side. And I think that it's you cannot just say that one life is worth less than another. In the war on terror after the 9/11 atrocity, quite right that people said that the lives lost on 9/11 were precious lives and should not have been lost. It's not right to say that an Afghan life or an Iraqi life or a Pakistani life is less precious. And it seems to me that once you lose sight of that equality of human preciousness, in my field of studying terrorism and counterterrorism, you're accentuating the likelihood of things getting worse. You're accentuating the dehumanizing possibility of violence. And I just as a scholar, I have no influence, Thomas, but as a scholar who does his best with his books, I will not accept that a Pakistani life is worth less than a life in the United Kingdom. I don't see any basis for that morally, and I also think it's catastrophic politically.
Dehumanization is always a precursor to worse things to come. Yeah, and I think it was Professor Omar Bartov told me that ethnic cleansing in turn is a precursor to genocide. So if you can't ethnically cleanse an area, what can you do? You kill them. I mean, it's a bit blunt.
I think Omar, whom I don't know personally, but I know his work, and I have an incredibly high regard for Bartov's work. I think he's a first-class scholar and a very moral voice. I think. And I think he's somebody who has pointed out that, the process of treating people as a problem to be removed in ethnic cleansing, for example, is not a basis for the kind of politics that I think any of us should be endorsing. I think the dehumanization of people is one of the catastrophes of the modern period. And goodness knows, we've seen enough appalling examples of vast violence to know where it can go if you dehumanize people, if you lose a sense that they deserve dignity and respect and humanity. That's why I think activists have a large role to play, humanizing people on all sides. Politicians clearly have a big responsibility. I think for those of us who live in democracies, voting is a big moral responsibility, voting for people who talk about international politics in ways which humanize rather than dehumanizing. And I think also recognizing the limitations of what violence is going to achieve. I mean, that's why I wrote the Does Terrorism Work book, was partly about saying, let's look at what it does achieve. But also for those of us who are saying it's not the thing that people should do, what are the ways in which we can create a politics which allows for momentum, which doesn't involve people being murdered? And that's really what I'm looking for. And in the work at the universities and when I give lectures, what I'm looking for is that rehumanizing of people, whichever part of the globe they're in, Thomas. I mean, I don't accept that lives are less significant if they're in a Palestinian community than if they're in an American community or if they're in a British community.
It's going to be difficult in Israel. So I interviewed Professor Nurit Peled El-Hanan, sister of Miko Peled, and she studied racism in Israeli school books. That means Israeli children are from the earliest ages on indoctrinated against the Arabs. Yeah. So that's going to be a long process whenever it ever starts.
It is. And I think, in itself, viewing people as lesser people is just a moral wrong. But I also think it's something which, for the community which is having that approach, it causes deep harm to that community too. I mean, I think you could make a similar point about racism within the United States of America against the African American community. That damages every community, most obviously the African Americans who are on the receiving end of it, but it also damages every part of the United States of America to have those legacies and to have to try to deal with them. It seems to me that some sense of what I would think of as a cosmopolitan humanizing, that everybody is equally precious, is a part of what we should be teaching children at school. I think it's a part of what we should be discussing in the media, I think on podcasts, I think in journalism, I think in books, I think in parliaments, I think in rallies. What we need to be doing is saying that we don't accept a hierarchy of human value, depending on geography, depending on race, depending on religion. I just don't accept that. And I think, goodness knows, I'm a historian, as you know, there are so many examples from history of where this ends. There are so many examples of it from history of where this ends, and it does not provide protection even for the people who are supposedly being defended by being at the top end of that hierarchy. It simply does not.
Yeah, and it seems globally we go in the opposite direction. From India to the Netherlands, where I live, we have a right-wing government now here. Viktor Orban, Hungary, etc., everywhere.
I mean, across mainland Europe, the shift to the right in recent times has been very striking. I mean, the United Kingdom is likely to be slightly out of step in that, while the Labour government is not going to be a particularly left-wing government. It's a Labour rather than Conservative government that seems about to be elected next month, as far as we can make out. But the rightward shift across much of Europe. It's not impossible that President Trump will become the president of the United States again later this year. The shift in Indian politics has been a very difficult one for many people, and I think has been one which I know academics in India have found very difficult because of the closing down of opportunities to offer views which are critical. And I think that being able to express views which are critical on all sides seems to me to be part of what we should defend. And again, I think that you mentioned Israel-Palestine in much of our conversation, Thomas, and I think allowing people to express views with which you disagree is an absolutely crucial part of this, and closing that down is something which is going to be doing long-term damage, particularly to the young. I think if the young people grow up and feel that they can't hear views they disagree with, if they can't engage in debate and persuasion, that presents a kind of politics which I think will be pernicious and as I say, will harm us all. There's an awful lot of reason to be pessimistic, isn't there? I mean, I think we have to hope that we can try and labour to get things back in a better direction. But the political realm in terms of elections this year, from my perspective, has not so far been all that encouraging.
And the young are actually the hope that you were talking about, because there's research done. The younger, the less support for Israel. The older, the more support for Israel. Because the younger ones, they have no access to information that previously was not available.
I think one of the interesting things for me in the Israeli discussion has been that some of those United States university campuses where the sympathy of the students has been overwhelmingly Palestinian. 20, 25 years ago, those campuses would have been overwhelmingly much more sympathetic to Israel in such disputes. And so in that sense, I think you have a generational shift. That will have big significance because also some of those universities are the universities which tend to educate people who end up running the country. It's Columbia University, it's Harvard University, it's Yale University, it's UCLA. These are factories of really influential figures in 20 years' time. So from the Israeli state's point of view, again, I think this is in the Israeli government and the Israeli state's interest. Doing something which doesn't provoke mass opposition to what your policies are is actually self-interested as well as the right thing to do in itself. And it seems to me that that shift is something which has been striking. And the speed with which those campuses have gone Palestinian is something which I think is indicative of a generational shift. And that generational shift, if it continues to have effect, will have a significant impact on the politics of Israel and Palestine because of the United States' pivotal financial and political significance as an ally of the Israeli state.
We'll see how long that still continues, especially with America being more and more in economic difficulties.
It is, and also that, I mean, there's a trend. There is a wing of politics in America which says, let's look inward, not outward. In any case, so whoever you're sympathetic for, why are we bothering? There's an aspect of that, and Trump's politics have played into that at some times as well. It seems to me, I mean, my view on this, Thomas, is that none of these things is inevitable. That's why when I'm thinking about the research involved or the writing involved in books or the engagement with students and debates and so forth, I think these things are contingent, not inevitable, and I think therefore we all have to try to do what we can to produce a thought context in which there's the possibility of actual debate and listening. In Ireland, I live in, as you know, in Belfast. Across most of Ireland, sympathy is more Palestinian than Israeli. Within Northern Ireland, there's a certain division between nationalists and unionists, but broadly speaking, in the Irish state, in the Republic, there's much more sympathy for Israel. Across the UK, the government of the UK have been very strongly pro-Israeli, but there have been very large marches in favour of Palestinians. And on university campuses across England, there's been quite a lot of activism, again, more Palestinian by far than Israeli. So there are debates happening which could affect things quite significantly in terms of governmental opinion. I want to sort of think of ways in which as many people as possible can be winners, and I think that's where the political weight of argument should lie.
Hope on the politicians. Yeah, I want to ask you as a second question, yeah, the comparison between the battle, of the IRA and, let's say, Hamas, yeah. But before, the politicians, right? They are so influenced. AIPAC, for example, yeah. Do you see any? I mean, if you look at the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict and the role that Great Britain played in it from the very beginning, like just throwing it back to the UN at the end, yeah. Would you not expect, same as the Germans are expected, yeah, to kind of be accommodating to Israel, to be accommodating to the Palestinians?
So one of the interesting points there, I think, Thomas, is that in the UK, there's an extraordinary amnesia about empire. So, for example, when the Iraq War emerged in 2003, a lot of people in the UK really hadn't known that the UK had any role in what became Iraq. It was just news to people. So there's this sort of sense almost that empire didn't happen. You then get these what are referred to wrongly as cultural wars about pro-empire, anti-empire, but for most people, they just don't remember it. So I think most people in England, Scotland, Wales, and possibly in Northern Ireland too, they're less so here, but in England, Scotland, and Wales, if you talk to them about Britain's role in regard to Palestine and the foundation of Israel, a lot of them wouldn't know very much about it at all. It's just been sort of erased from people's memory. And that means that politicians treat these things as though they're problems that are just arose without any history to them. Now, as a historian, I have to say, I think you have to look at the long term, long past and long futures. You have to look at the legacy of empire. You have to look at the responsibility there. But also even, Thomas, in terms of self-interest, is it benefiting any West European state to have a civil war many people in Britain, regardless of what the politicians are arguing for, have an instinctive sympathy with Palestinians at the moment because of the images of horror of what has been suffered by so many Palestinians. In that sense, it seems to me that one of the arguments I have made about many cases of counter-terrorism is that they overreact, that they over-militarize, and that they provoke an even greater sympathy for the people whom they're supposedly trying to deal with and extirpate. The level of scale of marches in Britain in favor of Palestinians have far outnumbered the level of support that there would be in Britain at popular level for Israel and its campaign at the moment.
I saw a march 2 months ago, or less than 2 months ago, apparently with 1 million people. Can it be wrong? Can it be right?
Yeah, the scale of the marches, the
Yeah.
only thing I've seen that's similar in Britain was when there were marches against the Iraq War, where you had a very large scale popular mobilization, again against the government that was seen to be supporting something that wasn't as widely endorsed. And so there is strong momentum in Britain. And I think that's replicated, isn't it, in many other countries around the world.
Yeah, but it's also symptomatic that the backlash, the militarized police that's being used to suppress is quite strong. I mean, the
I,
fear of the government, that's an indication for me of the fear of the government.
I think you've seen elements in the United States policing of campus protests, where particularly I think in Columbia University in New York, where there was a more heavy-handed response than was appropriate. I also think those things tend to rebound. I think people look at that and wonder whether that's just something which is entirely inappropriate as a reaction. I think the best way to deal with university protests is to engage in them as spaces of protest where people have a chance to say what they say. I think you can then engage with this in a way that's more constructive than happened in the Upper West Side of New York, certainly. Yeah, I mean, I also think the way you police a protest affects what the protest becomes. I think the more you militarize a response to a protest, the more likely you are to get aggravation and tension and violence between people. So generally speaking, things that diffuse are much more valuable than things that inflame, and that's true in counterterrorism as it is in dealing with protest.
If you look back, let's say when just before the creation of Israel, till before October 7, yeah, if we look on an objective level, who actually was terrorizing whom from an academic perspective?
So my argument there, Thomas, would be that there's terrorizing on all sides. I mean, there undoubtedly was Palestinian terrorism, the PLO, Hamas from the late 1980s onwards, unquestionably. But there's been Jewish anti-Palestinian pro-Israeli terrorism, if you like. The terrorist violence from the settlers has also been from an Israeli side rather than from a Palestinian side. I also think that some of what the Israeli state has done, it's not just non-state actors that carry out terrorizing political violence. Some of what the Israeli state has done has clearly been deliberately terrorizing political violence. My sense, therefore, is that an honest discussion of these things has to avoid saying that only one side does terrorizing violence. An honest discussion of it has to recognize the loss that there is on all sides and the violence which comes from different dynamics. I mean, you mentioned earlier comparisons with Northern Ireland. I mean, here in Northern Ireland, anti-state groups like the Provisional Irish Republican Army campaigned with violence on one side, but pro-state actors like the Ulster Volunteer Force Defence Association carry out hundreds of murders and maybe from a pro-state perspective, and there was also violence by state forces too. So in these cases, you have a kind of triangle often where you have anti-state, pro-state, and state violence at the same time. Now, if you have an analysis which just rules out one of those and pretends it's not happening, it's just not a plausible analysis. I mean, you can do that as a propagandist on one side or the other, and I understand the dynamics of that. But in terms of being an analyst in the sort of conversation we're having, you cannot plausibly say we'll forget about Jewish terrorism, or say we'll just ignore the terrorism of the Palestinians. Just as in Northern Ireland, it would have been entirely implausible to say it was only Republicans who did the killings, or it was only loyalists who did the killings, or the state never did anything. An honest discussion faces up to the violence on all sides, including the violence from the side with which somebody might be sympathetic. That's part of the debate to get to. Vital in Israel, vital in Ireland. I think also, I mean, one of the big interesting challenges over the next few decades will be extreme right-wing terrorism in the United States of America. Since 9/11, the likeliest violence that's going to be killing you in terms of violence by non-state actors in the United States of America is not actually from jihadists like Al-Qaeda. since 9/11, after 9/11. It's actually from right-wing sources. So in other words, there are challenges that come from all different places. If they're violent and you need to deal with them and you need to try and find the root causes for it and address it, that's what you should do, regardless of whether it's someone who has the same sort of political background as you, or the same racial background as you, or even some of the same political sympathies. The question is the violence and the harm that it is doing.
But the same is true for Israel. There's a great danger that going forward, the right-wing terrorists within Israel, because they're not going to stop.
This is one of the challenges. And of course, in the 1990s peace process, one of the difficulties was that the Israeli government deal with the PLO was made more difficult by Palestinian resistance from Hamas, for example, but also from Israeli terrorism. I mean, there were people who were anti-peace process terrorists engaged in awful violence. Now, at some stage, you have to decide that if you're making political progress towards a deal, you're going to address that, it seems to me. And I think the question for Israel is what kind of state it wants to be. And I think if it's going to be a state which just says it's going to be entirely one-sided on these questions, I personally think its own fragility will become greater. And I think certainly the violence will continue, and that's awful for everybody. It's not enough just to 18 people who are violent on your own side.
How do you qualify what happens in the West Bank right now, the activities of those armed settlers?
Because of what happened on 7 October and what's happened since then in Gaza, I think people have ignored the West Bank too much. I mean, a lot of the provocation that there has been towards Palestinians has been the treatments in the West Bank. Some of it is clearly terrorism.
But is it state terrorism, or is it non-state?
I mean, some of it has been terrorism, which the state has turned a blind eye to and allowed to happen.
Because the soldiers stand behind them, exactly.
And I think so. It seems to me that the idea that the state is neutral in the face of this is clearly wrong. And I also think that for an Israeli government to be credible internationally, it needs to recognize that violence from whichever source is to be equally condemned. So, for example, in the Northern Ireland conflict, the Northern Ireland state, the UK state in Northern Ireland, rather, had a more clear sense of being at war with Republican terrorists than with loyalist terrorists. It seemed to me that was a big mistake. I've argued this in my most recent book on counterterrorism. It seems to me that if you've got non-state actors murdering people, whether they're flying a British flag or an Irish flag, what they're doing is something that a liberal democracy should oppose. In the Israeli case, violence by settlers against Palestinians is something which the state should not tolerate. But of course, the state has been more indulgent of settlers than someone like myself feels is appropriate. And that goes a long way back. I think part of the difficulty for Palestinians with the 1990s process was that they looked at the increasing number of settlements and felt, well, is the government in Israel actually respecting the processes of peace, processes of negotiation, if they're taking more land, if they're developing it? And of course, some of that, not all of it, but some of that has an American dimension too, because some of the settlers are people who have American heritage.
It's more than heritage, they have American passports.
And American accents.
Exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And I think this is why I keep talking about human flourishing. It seems to me that if you're viewing it from a Palestinian point of view, it's very hard to see a politics which can really flourish for you and work for you if more and more land is being taken and if America and Israel is sanctioning that. And it's very, very hard to do that. And I think, therefore, the West Bank, quite rightly, Gaza is the focus at the moment because of the suffering. But the West Bank is every bit as important in terms of what's going to happen over coming decades in regard to that part of the world. And I think, I think the settlement has to be stopped. The new settlements have to be stopped. No, there are people who will oppose my saying that, Thomas, but it seems to me that I don't see how you can get security for Israel or progress for Palestinians if you continue to support increasing settlement.
Israel never has traded peace for land. Always preferred land.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think, well, the catastrophic outcome of not pursuing peace persistently was the atrocity of 7 October. As I say, that's not a justification at all. I think it's an unjustifiable atrocity. But it seems to me that the idea that you can ignore root causes and keep Israelis safe is a real falsity of argument. And I think that's where Israeli political arguments need to develop to make that case more strongly. And I think there are voices which are beginning to do that. But obviously the current crisis has made that more difficult for them.
We spoke about the settlers. So the settlers were armed by Ben Gvir, right? He's in the government, yeah? I have to say, I think it was Benny Morris, but don't tell me on a cross. I think it was Benny Morris who told me that any government in Israel right now who would try to achieve a just solution for the Palestinians would risk civil war.
But they kind of have a civil war anyway, Thomas, in a way. I mean,
What he meant was, of course, inter-Israel civil
yeah,
war, not
yeah,
war with
yeah,
yeah,
that it could accelerate between
yeah,
Israelis.
yeah.
It's a real risk. I mean, I think that after October the 7th, the mood has obviously become inflamed, and you can understand to an extent that that is one of the consequences of that atrocity. On the other hand, at some stage, if you're going to protect Israel in the long term, you can't carry on this trajectory. I mean, for one thing, even if you did get the kind of deal I would like to see involving the West Bank and Gaza, a significant minority of people within Israel itself are non-Jewish and feel second-class citizens and feel that that position is something that's intolerable. In other words, within Israel itself, you have a kind of Northern Ireland situation of the 1950s and 1960s, where you have a minority that's growing, that feels that it's been treated in a way that delegitimizes it, that doesn't treat it economically fairly, doesn't treat it fairly in terms of rights. There is no way that that is a sustainable body of people that you can control by silencing them in the long term. That's just not going to happen. So, I mean, it may be a risk if things are done too fast that you descend into an intra-Israeli civil war. On the other hand, Thomas, at the moment you have catastrophe for Israel in all sorts of ways, and they are losing significant international support. They are losing significant international support, and therefore it seems to me that facing down those people who want to dehumanize the Palestinians, paradoxically, is the best way of protecting Israeli Jews.
True. You said Northern Ireland. Are there any lessons that we can learn from the Northern Ireland conflict in regards to Israel and Palestine?
I think I would mention three things. I mean, one is I would say that in Northern Ireland, the lesson was learned by the UK state, but also by paramilitary groups, that you should not exaggerate what violence will achieve. I mean, when the peace process came in the north of Ireland, neither the IRA nor the UVF nor the British government got exactly what they wanted. And it came about through not pursuing violence, using violence to pursue victory, but came about through compromise. So the first thing is the exaggeration of violence and what it does has to be learned. Second thing is you have to look at root causes, not symptoms. I mean, there was terrible violence here, but it seems to me that just to concentrate on the violence misses the point that what you had was in Northern Ireland, as in a different way in Israel-Palestine, rival nationalisms fighting over state legitimacy. That's what the issue is, and that's something which you have to address. Third thing is that what the British government in the end did was combine the containment tactically of terrorist violence, limiting the number of bombs, limiting the number of shootings, with a twin track approach to produce a political sense of process. So you could say to Republicans in the IRA, we're containing you, most of your bombs are not going off, most of your operations are being thwarted, many of your people are agents and informers. But you could also say to their political wing, Sinn Féin, if the violence stops, you'll end up in government. If the violence stops, you'll end up with greater power and greater opportunities to develop things. So it wasn't just saying we're stopping the bombings. It was saying bombings are being contained, you're not going to violence. But you know, there's another way forward. Does it can work in Israel? Not automatically. Of course, there are big differences. But my approach to Israeli counter would be to say to tactically protect Israelis from violence. I think you need to protect Palestinians from violence, and I think they're equally important. But you need to say that there's a twin of tactical containment and political progress, not exaggerating the military means. So when Netanyahu and his colleagues say we'll pursue military means in order to stamp out Hamas completely, I don't believe that's going to happen. I don't believe that's going to happen. I think that what they're likely to do is to shore up a desire for revenge and hostility. Does that mean automatically you'll get something progressive in Israel if you follow a more northern pattern? No, although it does seem to me that people what might happen here and it worked. So Jonathan Powell, who is the British chief negotiator in Friday Agreement negotiations, makes the point there was nothing inevitable about the peace process in Northern Ireland. People used to say it wouldn't happen. Now people say it was inevitable. So maybe not lessons, but there is a sense of hope and a sense of possibility. But you have to first don't pursue military means. Second, tactically contain and produce politics. And thirdly, you need to recognize that there are just there are root causes behind these awful acts of violence on all sides, and ignoring those root causes doesn't really help any of us.
I think the root cause I want really to come back to a little bit more. But I think I heard you say that you actually interviewed Northern Ireland, also IRA terrorists. Was it correct?
Yes, indeed. I wrote a book on the IRA some years ago, and I interviewed people who'd been involved in that violence, yes.
Okay. Can we talk about the psychopathology, the so-called psychopathology of terrorists?
The overwhelming majority of people I interviewed who had been involved in the IRA were entirely normal. The literature on terrorism is pretty clear on this. The vast majority of people who are involved in terroristic violence are people who are like everybody else. The reason most people get involved in the violence is because they think that this is the best or only way of achieving precious or essential political change. I would argue they're wrong in that. I think there are other ways which are more benign for everybody in pursuing change. And I think that Northern Ireland, in the end, has demonstrated that there are ways of achieving something which was ultimately arrived at through dialogue and compromise. But they're very normal. I think the argument that terrorism is explicable because of psychopathology, it doesn't hold up in most cases. That doesn't mean that there are not some psychopaths in terrorist organizations. Of course there are, but there are some psychopaths in political parties. There are some psychopaths in sport. So I think the fact that there are some psychopaths in it, you can explain it through that. So our explanation from political motivation is a much better one than an explanation from psychopathology.
And that's exactly in line with the research of a young lady. She's called Yashid Yehoshua. She's an Israeli scientist, and she interviewed the last 20 years what Israel termed terrorist leaders in jail. And she said exactly the same. There's no psychopathology. They're not crazy. They're, you know, all these kind of stereotypes that we connect with terrorists are simply not there. Right?
I think sometimes people find that a difficult thing to hear because it's almost more comfortable to say these are monstrous psychopaths. I would turn it around, Thomas, and say that in some ways the normality of people who are involved in terrorism and in supporting it offers some hope. If people are normal and if I'm right and people are doing this because they think it's the only or best way of producing change, then if you can persuade people that there's a better way of producing change and can create that space, they'll go with it. So people used to say about the IRA, they'll never stop the violence because they're psychopaths and they're gangsters and this is just what they want to do. But as it turned out, when the peace deal arrived and they got something which was far short of what they had been demanding, overwhelming majority of Republicans have gone with that process and supported it. I think the lesson of the PLO is an interesting one, where, some decades ago, our conversation would have been about PLO hijackings. It would have been about PLO violence. And people at that stage said the PLO will never give up terrorism. They'll never recognize the state of Israel. But actually, what happened was a long and painful journey, but did involve a transformation. I know the Palestinian Authority is not a perfect institution by any means, but it does seem to me that from the Israeli point of view, to recognize that there was a journey on which people came to approach a different kind of means and a different kind of end is an encouraging one. So I think it's very important, as you're citing this scholar who's worked with prisoners and with leaders who are Palestinian, the normality of people involved in terrorism is in the end something which might be judged as encouraging rather than frightening.
And if we look now at the root cause and really at the most basic level, could we argue that the root cause of terrorism is connected to unjust allocation of resources, which in Palestine, Israel, is for me like as clear as can be?
I think an injustice in terms of resource, injustice in terms of over how resources are allocated, often therefore injustice in terms of access to state power. A lot of the time, it seems to me the terror that we're interested in discussing are about questions of legitimacy of the state. I mean, that ultimately is what Israel-Palestine is about. And your point, which is very right about resources, if you deny power over resources to people, if you deny them the operational capacity to look after their people, then that's something which is going to cause difficulties. But that was also what was the case in Northern Ireland. Actually, for a long time, the Basque separatist violence of ETA against particularly the Spanish state was about the sense that they didn't feel that the Spanish state was legitimate in its control over the Basque country. Again and again and again, this is the issue which is crucial. I think what happened was when 9/11 seized everybody's attention, people took their eye off the issue of the politics of statehood because they thought that it was all about this new kind of terrorism. Actually, a lot of the violence which jihadists have carried out is related also to power in particular circumstances. So the motivation behind ISIS violence was about actually questions of legitimacy and power in Syria and Iraq. It was actually quite recognizable to people who'd studied terrorism long before that kind of violence emerged. It was nowhere near as new as people talked about. And here, in a way, again, I think it's back to your point about normality, Thomas, because all of us are concerned about resources. All of us are concerned about having the capacity for people who are running the access to resources and the allocation of resources, treating people fairly and making sure that their lives can carry on. It's a perfectly normal consideration. Now, if you're looking at it from the Netherlands or from Belfast, it looks one way. If you're looking at it during the years of ISIS from certain parts of Iraq and Syria, if you're looking at it in the case of Palestinians in the West Bank, and particularly now in Gaza, these are real world normal concerns that people have. The question for us all is how can we try to remedy those injustices and imbalances of power? I also think that you discussed things being bleak earlier on politically. There are reasons to be anxious about how the future is going to go on this, because climate change and the effects of that on, particularly on some regions of the world and some poorer people who already have a different condition of life, to be catastrophic. And the way we think, therefore, about climate change is also about justice between different kinds of parts of the world and different communities, different national groups and racial groups. I'm dispirited by how limited our debate on that has been in the richer parts of the world. I mean, it's a catastrophe waiting to happen. And I think in that sense, justice is, in a way, when you're talking about terrorism, you're ultimately talking about justice.
We, the rich West, try to impose our rules on the poorer countries, which have not caused this climate crisis in the first place. Yeah,
and I think, I agree.
In regards to another topic, overlapping. Yeah? If you compare, well, you can't really compare it. Yeah, but if you have on one side the Israel-Palestine conflict and on the other side the Russia proxy war with the US or NATO, yeah, and just one nugget. NATO has now begun to take out one by one those these nuclear early warning systems within Moscow, up to 2,000 kilometers within Moscow. Yeah. So my channel focuses on two topics: Israel-Palestine conflict and Ukraine-American proxy war. Yeah. At the moment, and with Trump potentially coming into the White House. So at the moment, I have to say, I almost feel that the situation in Russia is even more dangerous than a potential confrontation with Israel, Iran, US, etc. Right? So, in terms of for you as a historian, yeah, where do you focus on? I mean,
I think the difficulty is that these are both huge crises, and the responses in terms of the West have been very flawed in both cases. I mean, first of all, the Putin invasion of Ukraine was treated as if it was something which just happened out of nowhere.
Same as October the 7th, as if it was falling out of the blue sky.
And what you needed to look at was the relationships which had preceded and the developments of it. I think there's also been a very marked difference in the way in which there was a response to governments all flew Ukrainian flags in the West for a long time, in a way that hasn't happened with Palestine, clearly. So there's been a sense of differential response to it in terms of refugees as well. And that's not in any way to lessen the suffering of Ukrainians who've suffered terribly. It's just to recognize the difference. My anxiety about it would be that there are political rewards for a certain kind of aggressive rhetoric in both democracies and autocracies. And at the moment, you have the possibility of that sort of escalatory rhetoric becoming a replacement for serious discussion of what should happen. I mean, the actual debate about Russia-Ukraine has been rather weak in the West. I mean, the condemnation of the violence by Russia has been voluminous, and of course there's much to condemn, and I support that condemnation, but you've got to go beyond condemnation now and say, well, how is this going to end, and how is this going to end in a way which doesn't involve some huge conflagration? And there's huge anxiety. I mean, it's one thing to view it from the United Kingdom or to view it from Washington DC, but if you're on some of the states a lot nearer to Russia, the anxiety is very palpable when you speak to people and listen to them about that, and the fragility of order in that potential danger. I think there is a real danger in Iran as well, and with the relations between states fighting a proxy war through Israel and Palestine in some ways as well. And I think what you need is responsible government. I mean, there I find it hard to be optimistic about the November election in the United States of America. It seems to me not a great choice again. And I think in that sense, what you're looking for is the people around whoever becomes president behave as responsible advisors, strategists, and so forth, because the presidential choice is not a good one. I think we're facing risk, and what we need is responsible leadership and dialogue. And also, it's been a theme of our conversation, Thomas, to look at root causes rather than just condemning symptoms.
Yeah, well said. Richard, any other topics that we did not cover that's close to your heart? Anything that's meaningful that you could provide us there?
What I would make is that in all of these things, you have to have realistic goals. You have to go for things. If you're talking about Russia, Ukraine, if you're talking about Israel, Palestine, in the past when we were talking about Northern Ireland, what is it that it's realistic for us to try and pursue? And I think one of the difficulties, and it's been implicit in what we've been saying, Thomas, a lot of the time people pursue, 100% victory, and not likely to emerge, and you the avoidance of compromise. And I think in that sense, responsible politicians will do is say, how can we maximize the humanizing engagement with people? Another issue, for example, is treatment of immigrants within Western countries. There is no serious discussion of immigration in terms of how people, the ways in which they're treated and the ways in which that has an effect on the nature of the society you live in. I think realizing that there are realistic approaches to these things is something which is going to be helpful, rather than the kind of exaggerated sloganeering which politicians often use. And what I'm looking for is people who have got responsible, humanizing approaches. And the people I want to vote for, Thomas, the people I want to support in politics, are people who treat every human being as equally deserving of respect, whether they're an immigrant or someone who's not been an immigrant, whether they're Russian or Ukrainian, whether they're Israeli or Palestinian. I don't hear enough of that politics. To the extent that our discussion contributes to that humanizing, I'm delighted. And I hope that people will carry on the debate.
Wise words at the end. Professor Richard English, it was my pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Thomas. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.
Likewise.